A young black man, Jalen Brooks, walked into a prestigious lecture hall where the top California mathematics professor Evelyn Grant was teaching, and when he boldly pointed out a mistake that even Grant had overlooked, the entire room fell silent. The professor refused to accept that a black student could be better than her and continuously threw challenges his way, hoping to make Jalen give up and fall. The white students below looked down on him, constantly sneering and saying that he wouldn't make it. But what they didn't realize was that they were facing a force far stronger than any student. Jalen was about to show them that skin color had nothing to do with a person's intellect and academic ability. The University of California, Berkeley stood as a monument to academic excellence, its grand architecture stretching across the campus like a testament to generations of intellectual pursuit. The campus was a sprawling mix of old-world charm and modern elegance, with stunning Gothic structures that seemed to touch the sky, their stone facades etched with the stories of past scholars. Yet as beautiful and grand as the physical space was, it wasn't the architecture that demanded attention, it was the people who inhabited it. In every corner of this prestigious university, you could find the children of the world's wealthiest families polished and poised, their expensive clothing and accessories marking them as part of the elite. Their conversations were laced with mentions of summer vacations in the Hamptons, internships at top tech companies, and internships at prestigious firms around the world. Their world was one of privilege, opportunity, and inherited success. They spoke as though they had a natural right to be here to take up space in this rarefied atmosphere. These were the students who had been born into wealth and opportunity, whose futures were already paved with golden roads. In this world, there was little room for people like Jalen Brooks. As he walked toward the lecture hall for his advanced calculus class, he couldn't help but notice how out of place he felt. The students around him wore designer outfits, polished shoes, expensive watches, and the kind of brand-name jackets that screamed exclusivity. They moved in groups, laughing easily, sharing jokes that he wasn't quite in on. Their presence was like a silent reminder that they belonged here, that this place was made for people like them, people who had always known they would be here. Jalen, on the other hand, was different. The 21-year-old black student was not here because of his family's wealth or connections. He was here on his own merit, his own intellect. But no one could see that, not immediately. They saw his faded hoodie, his worn-out sneakers, and his simple jeans. Nothing that suggested a person capable of competing with the elite minds in this room. His outward appearance was modest, unremarkable, even, but his mind was anything but. As Jalen entered the lecture hall, his eyes briefly scanned the room. It was an enormous space designed to hold over 100 students. The rows of seats stretched far and wide, with an imposing, almost intimidating ceiling that made the room feel cavernous. The stark white lighting above cast a clinical glow over everything, making it feel like a place for testing for judgment, not for learning. Today's the day when Professor Evelyn Grant would hold her infamous advanced calculus class. She is a woman in her mid-40s, with short, sleek hair and sharp features. She dressed in tailored clothing that only reinforced the no-nonsense persona she projected. Her silver-rimmed glasses caught the light, reflecting her icy gaze back at anyone who dared to make eye contact. Professor Grant was known for being a brilliant mind, but she was also feared. Her teaching style was unyielding, her expectations impossibly high, and she had little patience for students who couldn't keep up. At the front of the room, a group of distinguished professors from other departments had gathered, their eyes sharp, not there to learn, but to observe. Today was no ordinary class. It was an open lecture where Grant would showcase her unforgiving teaching style, and the best and worst would be revealed. And in a room full of students who had spent their entire lives being told they were exceptional, Jalen was the outlier. He wasn't the son of a tech mogul nor the daughter of a politician. He didn't have a prestigious legacy that backed his admission here. He was a first-generation college student coming from a working-class family. His success had nothing to do with connections. His success was his own, but that success was constantly overshadowed by the assumptions of those around him. As Jalen made his way to the middle of the lecture hall, the whispers started quiet at first, but growing louder as more students noticed him. The room's atmosphere shifted, becoming charged with the invisible weight of judgment. "What's he doing here?" someone murmured, not bothering to hide their curiosity. "I heard he only got in because of some diversity quota," Another student said, their voice thick with condescension. It was the same everywhere Jalen went, a world where his skin color seemed to speak louder than his achievements. The rich white students surrounded him like an impenetrable fortress, their assumptions a barrier that he could never break through. But Jalen didn't let their stares affect him. He sat down quietly in the middle row, opened his notebook, and prepared for class. He didn't need to stand out. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had his own path to follow, and he knew that today would be just another opportunity for him to show the world that he belonged. The moment Professor Grant entered, a chilling silence descended upon the room. The sharp click of her heels echoed across the floor as she made her way to the front, her posture straight, her silver-rimmed glasses gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. There was no need for her to command attention. She had already earned it. Every student in the room knew that they would not be able to meet her eyes for long, lest they risk drawing her wrath. As she scanned the class, her gaze briefly rested on Jalen. It was a quick glance, hardly a moment, but it was enough. It wasn't just an observation. It was a silent challenge. A question that she didn't need to ask aloud, but that resonated in every corner of the lecture hall. Do you really belong here? For a split second, her icy stare seemed to pierce through him, sizing him up, as if his presence was a problem that needed to be solved. But without a word, she moved on unfazed. The lecture hall settled as Professor Grant began her lecture. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she dove straight into multivariable limits, writing the equations with surgical precision on the board. The students scrambled to keep up, frantically typing notes on their laptops, writing as fast as they could. The equations on the board were complex, multi-layered, meant to challenge, meant to expose weaknesses. But Jalen wasn't scrambling. His mind worked differently from the others in the room. While the other students focused on copying down the equations as fast as possible, Jalen observed. He didn't write anything. His eyes moved steadily across the board, noting the patterns, the relationships between the numbers, the way the equations fit together. I near yours. To him, it was a puzzle that he had solved long ago. But then his focus sharpened. There was something wrong. A small mistake, a slight misstep in the way the transform had been applied, something so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed by the rest of the class, but not by Jalen. His brow furrowed as he analyzed the problem, and in that moment he knew he had to speak up. He knew that if he did, the eyes of the entire class would be on him, and not for a good reason, but his principals wouldn't let him ignore it. He couldn't just sit there while they all blindly copied down an incorrect solution. The moment was now. He raised his hand. The room went quiet. Every eye turned toward him, and even Professor Grant paused in her writing, her gaze snapping to Jalen. It was an imperceptible moment, but the challenge was clear. She regarded him with that same icy stare, the one that dared students to think they could correct her. Yes, Jalen, she said, her voice low, but laced with expectation. Jalen didn't hesitate. Professor, there's a mistake in the transform. The coefficient was introduced too early. He said, his voice steady, clear. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. The room held its breath. Grant didn't immediately respond. Her eyes didn't flicker with surprise or anger, just a cold, calculating look, as though she were weighing the implications of what he had just said. Slowly, she turned back to the chalkboard, pretending to scan the equations. But everyone in the room knew what was happening. Jalen had challenged her. The professors at the front exchanged glances, and Jalen could almost feel the collective judgment bearing down on him. The tension in the air was thick, but Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't there to back down. He was there to show that he belonged. Grant turned back to him, her smile thin and predatory. A mistake, you say? Her voice was calm, but beneath it, Jalen could feel the trap being laid out in front of him. Do you really think you can correct me? Jalen nodded, unyielding. Yes, I'm sure. For a brief moment, Grant's expression flickered just the slightest hint of uncertainty, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She turned back to the board, her fingers gripping the piece of chalk with a sense of finality. The room was still. The class was waiting for the next move, and Jalen was ready to make it. The room was still almost suffocating as Jalen stepped back from the board. He didn't look up at the professors or the students who were now fixated on him. His hand, though steady, still held the chalk, but his mind was already elsewhere on the problem he had just solved, on the sense of satisfaction that came not from proving someone else wrong, but from knowing he had done it on his own terms. There was no triumph in his expression, no smugness or arrogance, just calm, just precision. But the stillness in the room was different now. The power had shifted. Grant, whose expression had once been icy and unapproachable, now stood at the front, her back to the class, facing the blackboard, as she tightly gripped the piece of chalk in her hand. For a brief moment there was a flicker of something on her face. Perhaps doubt, perhaps annoyance, but whatever it was, it quickly vanished. She didn't want to admit it, not to the students, not to the other professors in the room, but the truth was clear. Jalen had done it, and she had been wrong. The fact that he had not only caught her mistake, but had also fixed it with such fluidity was something she hadn't prepared for. Grant wasn't used to being challenged, let alone by a student, especially not one like Jalen. The very notion that someone from a working-class background, someone who didn't look like the traditional math student, could outperform her in her own domain was enough to rattle her, though she would never admit it aloud. Professor Samuel Green, who had watched the entire exchange unfold with barely contained amusement, now shifted in his seat, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He had expected Jalen to falter, to make a mistake, anything really that would confirm his preconceived notions. But now, as the silence stretched longer than either of them had anticipated, Green could feel something unfamiliar in the air. Discomfort. He turned slightly toward the other professors, his lips tight, and exchanged a glance with one of them. "I didn't think he had it in him," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with a begrudging respect. "But I'll be damned if he didn't just prove me wrong." His words were quiet, but the tension in the room seemed to amplify them. A moment ago, Green had been certain that this student, this outsider, would be humiliated. But now it was clear that Jalen had earned something that was not easily given respect. A slight smirk tugged at the corners of Green's mouth. He wasn't ready to give up on his skepticism entirely, but Jalen had just made his first mark. Behind him, one of the guest professors, a woman from Stanford, leaned over to another colleague, her voice low but filled with awe. "I've never seen anyone do it that way." The way he broke down that transform, it was clean, efficient, almost too smooth. The colleague nodded, his eyes still locked on Jalen, now returning to his seat. "You're right. That was unexpected. I thought he'd mess up, but he didn't. The kid's got something. There's no denying that." Jalen's heart was still racing, but he didn't show it. He could feel the weight of their gazes, but he remained unaffected. He had no time for their judgment. He had done what he came to do. The moment Grant had turned to face the board again, he'd known what was coming. Another test, another attempt to undermine him. It wasn't over, not yet. He had to keep his focus. Grant finally spoke, her voice colder than before, her tone sharp, with a controlled anger that barely masked her discomfort. "Very well, Jalen," she said, her gaze flicking back to him for just a moment before she returned her attention to the board. "You've corrected the mistake, but let's see if you can handle something more difficult." She wrote a new equation on the board faster this time, as though trying to bury him in a sea of symbols and variables. The equation was long, complicated, and at least from a glance, impossible to solve without intense focus and skill. The room tensed again. The students in the front row leaned forward, their eyes darting between the board and Jalen. Some whispered quietly among themselves, as if this was their last chance to see him fail. But others, like Emma Carter, who had been watching Jalen intently throughout the entire exchange, could see the determination in his eyes. Emma, a quiet student with long, dark hair, was one of the few who had never doubted Jalen. She had been his friend for years, ever since they had met in their first year. "Ori, sorry." Where others saw a student who didn't belong, she saw someone who had every right to be there. Emma could see how the weight of the situation didn't seem to faze him. She knew that Jalen wasn't just a student. He was someone who had fought his way here, who had earned every right to be at Berkeley. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "He's got this," Emma whispered to herself, barely audible but filled with the quiet confidence she had always had in him. At the front of the room, Grant continued to write the chalk, making sharp, quick strokes against the board. Jalen could hear the whispers, the murmurs of doubt in the air, but he blocked them out. His eyes were on the problem in front of him. The numbers and symbols on the board were starting to align in his mind, a series of connections forming like a web. He could see it clearly now, the path to the solution. His hand reached for the chalk once more, moving toward the board with a steady confidence. Grant's eyes flickered in his direction, and for a moment Jalen saw a subtle change in her expression. The faintest sign of uncertainty. She wasn't sure what to expect, and that in itself was a victory. As he began to write, his mind flowed through the problem with fluid ease, the solution unfolding before him like a map he had already memorized. He didn't need to hesitate. He didn't need to check his work. The numbers and variables fell into place effortlessly. He was solving the problem with an elegance that made it look simple, but it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. This was a challenge, but he was handling it as though it was just another day. The class had gone silent again. This time, it wasn't just the students who were in shock. Even the professors who had initially dismissed him as unworthy were watching intently. Some of them had crossed their arms, their faces unreadable, while others shifted in their seats, visibly uneasy. Jalen finished the last step of the equation and set the chalk down slowly, looking at the board with a quiet satisfaction. He had done it. And this time there was no question about whether or not he belonged. As he returned to his seat, the murmurs began again. The students who had once doubted him were now exchanging looks of disbelief. Grant didn't speak immediately. She was still at the front of the room, but her gaze was now directed at the board, her mind racing as she processed what had just happened. She hadn't expected this. Not from him, not from someone like him. And yet there it was. The perfect solution. Unmistakable, undeniable. Grant turned slowly to face the class, her face unreadable. The tension in the air was thick as she looked at Jalen, who was already back in his seat, his expression calm and focused. She was about to speak, but she hesitated for just a moment, long enough for the entire room to notice. Then she spoke, her voice tight, her words clipped. "Well done, Jalen. It seems I underestimated you." The words weren't warm. There was no praise, no recognition of the effort it had taken to get here, but it was an admission of something far more important she had lost. The class waited in silence, unsure of what would happen next. Grant picked up the chalk again, writing a new problem on the board, this time even more complicated than the last. The challenge was clear. If Jalen was going to maintain his position, if he was going to truly belong here, he would have to face this next test, and it would be a test like no other. Professor Grant's hand moved with sharp precision as she filled the board with the next problem, one line bleeding into the next, like an intricate maze of logic and complexity. This wasn't just difficult, it was designed to be impossible for an undergraduate to solve without stumbling, hesitating, or second-guessing every step. Higher-order differentials, nested functions, and inverse matrix transformations layered over one another in a sequence that looked more like abstract art than mathematics. The entire room knew what this was. It wasn't instruction anymore. It was a declaration of war. Jalen sat motionless, watching the board as each line appeared, not flinching, not blinking, but behind his stillness was a storm. His chest rose and fell slowly, rhythmically, not from fear, but from concentration. He was calculating. Not just the numbers, but the pressure. He felt every set of eyes drilling into him, waiting to see if the last victory was a fluke, a lucky moment in an otherwise ordinary student's life. But Jalen knew luck had never been part of his story. He had grown up in places where schools didn't have enough textbooks, where teachers rotated through classrooms like factory shifts, too tired to care who learned and who didn't. Every skill he had, every theorem he understood, every concept he mastered, he had fought for it, clawed for it, earned it in silence when no one was watching. And now, under the glare of scrutiny, with professors lining the front row like judges at a tribunal, he wasn't going to flinch. Professor Green leaned back again, narrowing his eyes, the condescension no longer smug, but strained. "She's pulling out graduate-level mechanics now," he whispered to the Stanford professor beside him. "If he stumbles here, it all comes crashing down. The class will forget what he did earlier. People only remember how you end." The Stanford professor didn't respond right away. She was watching Jalen closely, noting the way his gaze tracked each line on the board, without breaking, without blinking. "He hasn't touched his pen," she said finally, her voice thoughtful, not skeptical. "He's visualizing it first. That's what the best do." Jalen's hand moved slowly to the edge of the desk where the same worn-out notebook from earlier rested. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. His eyes moved over the board one more time, and then he stood up. The whisper of the chair against the floor echoed across the room like a gunshot. Students froze. A few exchanged nervous glances. Some smirked, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Emma Carter felt her breath catch. She'd seen Jalen under pressure before during midterms, during oral defense prep, but this was different. This wasn't just academic anymore. This was personal. The way Grant had written that problem, the way she stood with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, told Emma everything she needed to know. Grant wasn't teaching. She was daring him to fail. Emma bit her lip. "Don't let her get to you," she whispered under her breath. But Jalen was already moving. He walked toward the board with quiet precision, not fast, not slow, just steady, like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield where everyone expected him to die. As he reached the front, Grant didn't move. She stepped slightly aside, her face unreadable. There was no invitation this time, no mocking smile, just silence. Jalen picked up the chalk, turning it in his fingers, once feeling its weight, and then he exhaled and started writing. The first stroke hit the board with confidence, then another. Each line of his solution began to unravel the complex knot Grant had drawn. He wasn't copying a method from a textbook. He wasn't following memorized steps. He was deconstructing the entire problem in real time, simplifying where others would complicate, bypassing detours that would trap even graduate students. His approach wasn't just correct, it was elegant, efficient, minimalistic. Every stroke had purpose. In the back of the room, a student, Ryan, a senior majoring in applied mathematics, leaned forward in his seat. He had been skeptical of Jalen from the start, but now his expression was different. "Wait." That shortcut, he whispered to his friend. "That's not in any of the standard proofs. That's something you'd only see in a research paper." His friend stared at the board wide-eyed. "It's like he's not solving the problem. He's rewriting it." The class was frozen. The only sounds were the faint scratches of chalk and the occasional creak of shifting seats as students leaned in closer, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Jalen didn't stop to analyze, didn't pause to double-check. He trusted his mind. Every calculation, every rearrangement, every skipped step, it was deliberate. He was solving it not as a student playing defense, but as someone in full command of the space. Grant's arms slowly uncrossed. Her eyes narrowed further. She stepped slightly closer, watching the board now with a growing unease. The solution was almost done, and not only had Jalen not stumbled, he had taken a path she hadn't even considered. He had exposed a simpler route through her own problem, one that turned her carefully constructed trap into a showcase of his brilliance. She felt the twist in her gut sharp and unwelcome. Jalen finished the final line, set the chalk down in the tray with a soft clink, and stepped back. No fanfare, no glance at the room. He just stood there, arms behind his back, calm, centered. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. It was the silence of a room that had just witnessed something impossible. Grant stared at the board for a long moment, her eyes scanning each line, searching for anything she could refute an error in notation, a misapplied principle, any technical flaw she could cling to. There was none. It was flawless. Professor Green looked down at his own notepad, the notes he had been taking suddenly meaningless. He glanced at Grant, then at the board, then at Jalen, and for the first time that afternoon, he said nothing. The Stanford professor finally leaned back and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He didn't just solve it," she whispered. "He dismantled it." Emma felt a smile form at the edge of her lips, not one of surprise, but of pride. She had known. From the first day she met him, she had known. And now everyone else did too. Grant turned slowly to face the room. Her posture remained firm, but her face had changed. The icy mask of certainty she had worn for years had cracked just enough for the truth to seep in. "Well," she said finally, her voice even, but devoid of its former sharpness, "it appears Mr. Brooks is not easily shaken." It wasn't praise, it wasn't warmth, but it was acknowledgement. And in a place like this, that meant everything. Jalen returned to his seat without a word. He opened his notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and began writing calmly as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shifted the entire dynamic of the classroom, but something had changed. Everyone knew it. The board behind him stood as a monument, a quiet testament to a truth they could no longer ignore. He didn't belong here because someone had let him in. He belonged because no one could keep him out. The tension in the room hadn't fully dissipated, and even though Jalen had solved the impossible problem with almost effortless grace, Professor Grant wasn't done. The chalk had barely left her hand before she was writing a new challenge on the board, one more intricate, more complicated than anything before. The symbols seemed to dance across the board, intertwining with each other, a chaotic symphony of mathematical constructs that were meant to push even the best minds to their limits. Jalen's eyes traced the board, watching as the numbers and functions took shape. But this time, he wasn't just looking for a solution. This time, something inside him stirred. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anxiety. It was the quiet realization that this wasn't just a problem anymore. This was a test of everything he had fought for. This was the moment that could break him or build him into something more. He took a breath, steadying himself. In the back of the room, Ryan, the senior majoring in applied mathematics, felt his heart rate pick up. He had watched Jalen's earlier triumph with a mix of awe and disbelief. But now, as the new problem appeared on the board, Ryan's skepticism crept back. Could he really solve this too? Ryan was no stranger to difficult problems. He had faced them time and again, and yet the complexity of this problem was almost beyond belief. It was the kind of problem that would send most students scrambling for their notes, doubting their ability to finish. It was what every math student feared, the kind of problem that made you question whether you even belonged in the room. Ryan glanced over at his friend sitting beside him, his voice barely a whisper. This is it. No one, not even him, can handle this. It's too much. His friend, still unsure whether to believe in Jalen, just nodded. We'll see. But if anyone can, it's him. Jalen, however, didn't hear them. His focus had already shifted, his mind zeroing in on the new equation like a predator hunting its prey. This was more than just a problem. This was his proving ground, his moment to solidify his place in this world. He felt the weight of the classroom on his shoulders, but he didn't let it break him. Instead, he welcomed it. He had already been underestimated his whole life. Now, in this room, in front of all these people, he would show them that he belonged. Professor Grant watched him from the front of the room, her eyes unreadable, but there was something in the way she held herself, something that betrayed her unease. This wasn't how she had expected the class to go. She hadn't expected Jalen to continue challenging her, to not only rise to the occasion, but to do so with such ease. It irked her. It unsettled her, and that, more than anything, was something she couldn't allow. She had built a reputation for being a teacher who did not suffer mediocrity, a teacher whose methods were unforgiving. She wasn't going to let this student, this nobody from a working-class background, make a fool of her. Jalen took the chalk in his hand, his fingers wrapping around it with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours practicing studying solving problems alone in his room. He had lived for moments like this, moments where everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was put to the test. As he approached the board, he could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, the silent judgment. But instead of letting it crush him, he used it. His eyes flickered briefly to the clock in the back of the room, noting the time as it ticked away with slow, deliberate precision. He wasn't in a rush. He knew exactly what he needed to do. His hand moved swiftly across the board, each stroke of the chalk an extension of his thoughts, as if the equations were already written in his mind, waiting to be released. The steps he took were simple, elegant, and he found himself lost in the rhythm of it. The problem, no matter how complex, was becoming clearer and clearer with every motion. He felt the tension in the room begin to shift. The skepticism he had seen in the eyes of his classmates, the doubt that had weighed on him since he first stepped into this classroom, was beginning to fade. He wasn't just solving a problem, he was rewriting the rules. Grant's gaze never left him as he worked. Her arms were still crossed, her expression still set in that familiar, almost cold mask. But something had changed. She wasn't just watching a student solve a problem, she was watching someone who might be her equal. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of doubt. She didn't like it. She didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't ignore it. Could he actually be better than I am? It was a thought that gnawed at the back of her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. She had to dismiss it. She had spent years building this image of herself as untouchable. She couldn't let a student, especially not someone like him, shake that. In the back of the room, Emma watched Jalen with a quiet intensity. She had seen him work in ways no one else had. She had seen him push himself harder than anyone else, studying late into the night, poring over textbooks, testing himself on problems that would have made most students give up. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He wasn't doing this for the applause. He was doing it for himself. Emma knew that. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened as he moved through each step, the way his eyes narrowed in concentration. He was here to prove a point, not just to the others, but to himself. As Jalen finished the final line of the equation, he set the chalk down with a soft click, his expression calm but his heart racing. The room was still. No one spoke. Even Professor Grant had paused, her gaze fixed on the board. There was no question about whether Jalen had solved it. He had. The problem had been dissected, turned inside out, and laid bare for everyone to see. It wasn't just a solution, it was a statement. Grant's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment she said nothing. The silence stretched out until it felt unbearable. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of the other professors, the students who were now staring at Jalen in a mix of awe and disbelief. There was no mocking smile on her lips this time, no dismissive tone. She looked at Jalen and then finally at the board. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod. "Well," she said at last, her voice thin and tight, "it appears you're right. Congratulations, Jalen." It wasn't much, but for Jalen it was everything. It was all he had needed. Not the praise, not the recognition, but the acknowledgement. It was the one thing he had fought for, the one thing he had been denied his whole life, the chance to show that he was more than they thought, the chance to prove that he belonged. As Jalen sat back down, he could feel the weight of the room's gaze shifting once again. The students who had once looked down on him, who had whispered behind his back, now stared at him with something resembling respect. The professors who had expected him to fail now saw him in a new light. Jalen didn't care about their opinions. He didn't care if they saw him as anything more than a student, but he couldn't deny the feeling that washed over him. The battle wasn't just about math anymore. It was about so much more. It was about reclaiming his worth, his place in the world. And for the first time that day, Jalen felt like he had finally earned it. After Jalen's perfect solution to the complex equation, the room still hummed with a quiet tension, though now it felt different, less oppressive, more expectant. It was as though the air had thickened, becoming charged with something palpable. Jalen had done what no one had expected. He had solved the impossible. He had turned their doubts into silence. But as he settled back into his seat, his gaze still fixed on the board in front of him, Professor Grant wasn't finished yet. She hadn't come this far just to let a student like Jalen undermine her authority, not in front of everyone. She didn't speak for a long moment, her mind calculating the next step, planning her counterattack. It wasn't just about the class anymore. It was about more than pride. She had to show them all that no matter how brilliant Jalen was, he still had a place in this system. This world where hard work was no substitute for the pedigree that was supposed to be the true marker of success. "Jalen," she finally said, breaking the silence, her voice now sharper than before, "you've proven you can solve problems in my classroom. But that's not enough." Jalen's eyes flickered, but he didn't move. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew what was coming. "I've been thinking." Grant continued, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "There's a national math competition coming up next month. The brightest minds from top universities across the country will be there. MIT, Stanford, Caltech. The best of the best. And if you're so confident in your abilities, perhaps you should enter." The challenge was obvious. It wasn't just an invitation to a competition, it was a dare, a way for Grant to test Jalen to prove once and for all whether he was truly capable or just lucky. The class fell into stunned silence. Some students exchanged glances, some shook their heads in disbelief, unsure whether to laugh or to feel pity for Jalen. They knew the caliber of the competition. They had seen the caliber of the students who would participate. And no matter how talented Jalen was, no matter how much he had proven his abilities here, they all knew that this competition was another beast entirely. Emma, sitting a few rows behind Jalen, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that Jalen didn't back down from a challenge, but she also knew that this wasn't the kind of challenge you could prepare for in a month. This was a test of everything, the kind of competition that could destroy someone's confidence if they weren't ready. Emma wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of pressure. "You don't have to do this," she whispered to herself, but she knew it was pointless. Jalen didn't need anyone telling him what to do. He had never been one to back down. Professor Samuel Green, who had watched Jalen from the beginning, now leaned back in his chair with a hint of amusement. But there was something else there, a slight unease. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where Jalen's confidence would finally shatter, where he would be exposed for what Green had always believed him to be, an outsider trying to play in a game that was beyond his reach. "He'll regret this," Green murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. "A month isn't enough time. Not even close." The Stanford professor, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "You think so?" She tilted her head, her eyes still locked on Jalen. "I'm not so sure. If anyone can handle it, it's him. He's got a different kind of confidence." Green shook his head, but he didn't argue. He wasn't sure anymore. He had seen something in Jalen that he hadn't expected, a quiet, unshakable determination that made it impossible to dismiss him entirely. But even that wouldn't be enough for the national competition. A month was too short. The pressure, the level of competition, it was a different world. Jalen's hand tightened around the edge of his notebook as Professor Grant's challenge settled over him like a weight. A national math competition. It was an opportunity to prove that he was more than just a student who solved problems in classrooms like this one. It was a chance to show the world, to show everyone who had ever doubted him that he didn't need pedigree to succeed. But there was something else gnawing at him, something deeper. The thought of the pressure, the magnitude of the challenge, made his heart race. Could he do it? Could he really go toe-to-toe with the best minds in the country? Minds who had been trained for years by top professors. Minds who had been preparing for this moment their entire academic lives. Could he compete with them and come out on top? The uncertainty wasn't something Jalen was used to. He had never let self-doubt stop him before, but this was different. This was the moment that would define everything. And still, the decision didn't feel like a choice. He had to do this. He had to prove to everyone, not just to Grant, not just to his classmates, but to himself, that he belonged in that competition. He wasn't just here to fill a seat. He was here to win. Jalen raised his hand slowly, his voice steady as he spoke. "I'll participate." The room was stunned into silence. Even Professor Grant seemed momentarily caught off guard, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read him, trying to discern if he was serious. The students whispered among themselves, some skeptical, others intrigued. Emma let out a quiet breath, unable to hide the flicker of concern in her eyes. But she knew Jalen was in this now, and there was no backing down. Grant's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it was tinged with something darker. "Good," she said, her voice cold but purposeful. "I'll make sure you're prepared. You'll need to be. The competition isn't like anything you've faced here." She turned away from the class, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, signaling the end of the lesson. Jalen stood up, his mind already working, calculating, planning. He didn't need her help. He had always prepared for these kinds of moments on his own. A month wasn't much time, but he would make it count. He would study harder than he ever had before. The challenge had been set. He had accepted it. And now nothing would stop him from proving that he was more than capable. As the class dispersed, Emma caught up with Jalen in the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jalen, are you sure about this? I mean, the pressure is insane. Do you really think you can do it?" Jalen looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've always had to prove myself. This is just another way to show everyone who I am. I've got a month to prepare, and I'll make it count." Emma nodded, though she couldn't shake the unease creeping in her chest. She knew Jalen. She knew his determination. But this was bigger than anything he had ever faced. She hoped he was ready. In the weeks that followed, Jalen buried himself in preparation, diving into advanced textbooks, reviewing problems from past competitions, studying the techniques of the country's brightest minds. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that he was up against the best of the best. But the more he studied, the more he realized that this wasn't just about math. It was about defying expectations, about proving that he belonged in a world that had never really accepted him. And with every passing day, as the pressure mounted, Jalen felt more certain than ever that he was ready. For the next month, Jalen's life is all about equations, textbooks, and late nights. Each morning, he woke up before dawn, the quiet stillness of the world outside his window mirroring the calm in his mind. The university was always busy, always full of life, but in those early hours, the campus felt deserted. Jalen preferred it that way. He needed solitude, the kind of solitude that allowed him to focus, to think, without distraction. His days were filled with intense study sessions, tackling problem sets that no one had ever expected him to be capable of solving. His notebook, once pristine and neatly organized, became a collection of scribbles, equations, and messy calculations. There was no room for mistakes now. Each night, Emma sat across from him in the library, her eyes never leaving her friend as he worked. She knew how much this meant to him. She had seen him study for hours, poring over textbooks, revisiting concepts that should have been simple by now, but he would never let himself rest until every last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. There were times when Emma wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to tell him to take a break, but she never did. She knew that this was Jalen's way. His mind didn't rest until every question had an answer and every challenge had been met head-on. One evening, as they sat in the corner of the library, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixing with the occasional turn of a page, Emma spoke quietly, almost as if to herself. "Jalen, do you ever think about what happens if you don't make it?" Jalen paused for a moment, his pen hovering over the page. He looked up at her, his gaze steady. No, I can't afford to think like that. It's not about making it or failing. It's about knowing that I've done everything I can. I can't control what happens next, but I can control how hard I fight. Emma nodded, biting her lip as she watched him turn back to his work. He was right, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a battle far beyond anything they had faced before. It wasn't just about math. It was about everything Jalen had fought for to get to this point, the long hours, the isolation, the doubts, and the judgments. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but he never showed it. Not to Emma, not to anyone. Across the campus, the professors and students who had once looked down on Jalen continued their quiet dismissals. Professor Green, always sitting in the front row, had never once believed that Jalen would make it this far. He often muttered under his breath to his colleagues, his words laced with thinly veiled amusement. It's a matter of time before he cracks. A month of preparation isn't going to do anything against students who've been training for this their entire lives. He doesn't stand a chance. Even the students who had initially supported Jalen began to express their doubts. Do you really think he's ready for something like this? One of them asked Emma, their voice filled with uncertainty. A month isn't enough. The competition will be brutal. The kind of problems they're going to throw at him. It's just too much for someone who hasn't been studying with the best professors his whole life. Emma kept her thoughts to herself, but she could feel the weight of their doubts hanging in the air like an invisible cloud. It was hard to ignore the whispers, hard to drown out the skepticism that seemed to follow Jalen wherever he went. But she refused to let it distract her. She had seen Jalen push himself harder than anyone else. She knew he had it in him, even if no one else did. One night, as they sat together in the quiet, dimly lit library, Jalen scribbled down the last few lines of a particularly difficult problem. He didn't speak, didn't pause for a break. His eyes were locked on the notebook in front of him, his mind consumed by the numbers and symbols that swirled around him. Emma watched him, her heart heavy with concern. She had never seen him like this before. The pressure of the competition was beginning to show. Jalen's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his shoulders slumped under the weight of expectations. But even so, he didn't stop. "It's okay to rest, you know," Emma said softly, her voice a gentle reminder of the world outside of equations. "You don't have to do this all alone." Jalen didn't look up. He knew Emma cared. He knew she was worried about him. But in that moment, he couldn't allow himself to stop. "I can't rest until I know I'm ready. I can't afford to stop now. If I'm not ready for this, then I'm just proving them all right." Emma sighed, her heart breaking a little as she watched him push through the fatigue. She wanted to tell him it was okay to take a break, to remind him that he was already doing more than enough, but she didn't. She knew that Jalen had to find his own way through this. All she could do was be there, quietly supporting him from the sidelines. As the days wore on, Jalen's resolve grew stronger, but so did the doubts of everyone around him. The professors at Berkeley still didn't believe he had a real chance. Even Grant, who had reluctantly acknowledged his skills in class, couldn't fathom the idea that Jalen might actually be able to beat the nation's best. Her face, usually so confident now, betrayed a hint of unease when she spoke about him. "He's fast," she admitted to a colleague one afternoon. "But speed isn't enough at that level. The competition will crush him." She never said it to Jalen's face, of course. She didn't need to. Everyone around him felt it. And yet despite all of it, despite the relentless doubts, despite the skepticism, Jalen continued to prepare with unwavering focus. There was no room for second-guessing, no room for doubts. 1 week before the competition, as Jalen stood alone in the library, flipping through a particularly challenging set of problems, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Am I really ready for this? The thought lingered in his mind for only a fraction of a second before he pushed it aside. He had no choice but to believe in his preparation. He had done everything he could, studied every angle, pushed himself harder than he had ever pushed before. If it wasn't enough, then so be it. But he would never know unless he tried. Emma stood in the doorway watching him from a distance. She could see the exhaustion in his face, but also the quiet determination. He hadn't given up, not once. She smiled softly to herself, proud of the man he had become. "You've got this," she whispered to herself. And, even though she had no idea what the outcome would be, she knew one thing for certain: Jalen had already won. The day of the national math competition had finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the vast auditorium at the University of Pennsylvania felt different from any other exam Jalen had ever taken. It wasn't just the sheer scale of the event, though that alone could easily overwhelm anyone. No, it was the weight of the challenge that pressed down on him, the realization that everything he had worked for in his life had led him to this single moment. His heart beat steadily in his chest, but he could feel the tension in his muscles, the steady thrum of nerves just below the surface. This wasn't just a test of his math skills. This was the moment when everything, the years of doubt, the judgments, the whispers, would either break him or make him into something more. Jalen took a slow breath as he entered the massive hall. It felt like a coliseum full of warriors who were all there for the same purpose, to prove who was the best. He glanced around his eyes, taking in the hundreds of students from top-tier universities, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Caltech. They were all here, sitting in perfect rows, their faces a mixture of focus and quiet confidence. Some students looked unfazed, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Others were visibly tense, their palms sweating, their eyes darting nervously toward the exam papers that had already been distributed on the desks in front of them, but none of them were looking at Jalen. That was something he couldn't ignore. They weren't curious anymore. They weren't mocking him. They had learned in the last month that he wasn't someone to be taken lightly, and that in itself made Jalen feel like he belonged here. He wasn't just a student from a diversity quota, as some had once believed. He had proven to them that he was just as capable, just as worthy of being here. Jalen sat down at his assigned desk, setting his notebook and pens in front of him. His fingers brushed lightly over the paper, but he didn't start immediately. He allowed himself a few moments to center his thoughts. "You've prepared for this," he reminded himself. "This is your moment." A voice echoed through the microphone in the front of the hall, drawing everyone's attention. "Welcome, contestants," the voice boomed, clear and commanding. "You are the best and brightest minds from across the country. Today you will be tested in a series of challenges designed to push you to your limits. Only those who can handle the pressure will succeed." The voice paused, and the judges sitting in their elevated chairs at the front exchanged knowing glances. "Let the competition begin." The first problem appeared on the giant screen at the front of the room, and Jalen's eyes immediately locked onto it. It was complex, a series of multi-step integrations and nested functions, each line building off the last. But Jalen didn't hesitate. His mind moved quickly, calculating the necessary steps in his head. Before he even put pen to paper, he didn't need to look at his competitors. He didn't need to gauge their progress. This was his race, and the only person who mattered was the one sitting in his seat. With quick, confident strokes, he began solving the problem. The numbers fell into place effortlessly, the transformations unfolding as if they had always been there. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was dismantling it, simplifying it, making it more accessible with each step. The room around him was quiet. In the corner of his eye, he noticed one of the MIT students glancing over at his work, a hint of surprise on their face. Jalen allowed himself the briefest of smiles. He had already passed the first hurdle. A few rows behind him, Emma watched him intently, her eyes fixed on his back as he worked. She had always known that Jalen was capable of this, but seeing him in this moment, seeing him surrounded by the best students in the country, made her heart swell with pride. She had seen him pore over textbooks for hours, had seen him push himself to the limit, time and time again. She had been there when no one else believed in him. And now, watching him solve problem after problem, she knew that all the late nights, all the sacrifice had led him here. He wasn't just participating in this competition, he was owning it. "Look at him go," whispered one of the students next to Emma, an undergrad from Stanford. "He's fast. I didn't think he'd be this fast." Emma gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving Jalen. "He's more than just fast. He's efficient. He's breaking down each part of the problem in ways I've never seen before." Emma's confidence in him was unwavering, but even she couldn't deny that Jalen was rising above the expectations of even the most seasoned competitors. Every minute that passed, every problem he solved seemed to confirm it. Jalen belonged in this arena. The first round ended, and the next set of problems appeared. This was where things would really heat up. Jalen took a deep breath as the next challenge filled the screen. It was a monster of a problem, a series of nonlinear equations that spiraled inward like a maze, impossible to navigate unless you understood its structure from the inside out. Jalen's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment that could make or break him. This was the kind of problem that would trip up even the most experienced mathematicians. But Jalen didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. He had trained for this moment. His mind worked through the problem quickly, the patterns unfolding before him like a map he had already memorized. He didn't second-guess himself. He knew exactly what needed to be done, every transformation, every variable's role in the solution. The clock ticked away relentlessly, but Jalen was unfazed. His pen moved swiftly across the page, and with each passing second, he moved closer to the solution. It was becoming clear that he wasn't just participating in this competition, he was dominating it. His method was different. It wasn't just about finding the answer, it was about finding the most efficient way to reach it. And with every equation he solved, he was making it look effortless. Ryan, still sitting in the back, had stopped working on his own paper. He was watching Jalen now, his jaw slightly slack. "He's already halfway through," Ryan muttered, barely believing what he was seeing. "There's no way he's that far ahead. I can't even wrap my head around the first part." One of his classmates, a PhD student from Caltech, leaned over, squinting at Jalen's work. "Wait a minute. Look at the way he's simplifying the system. That's not something anyone here would do. That's advanced." Ryan's eyes widened. "I thought it was impossible, but he's not even slowing down." Jalen didn't hear them. He didn't hear anything except the steady rhythm of his thoughts, the quiet hum of concentration that filled his mind as he worked through the problem. The world around him had narrowed to just one thing, solving this challenge. The clock was ticking down and he was running out of time, but the more pressure he felt, the more his mind sharpened. The last few moments of the round passed in a blur, and Jalen set his pen down with a quiet exhale. The judges began to walk around the room, collecting papers, but Jalen remained seated calm and composed. He hadn't just completed the round, he had finished it faster than anyone else. He had outpaced them all, not by rushing, but by mastering the problem in ways they hadn't even considered. As the first round came to a close, the judges began announcing the scores, but the whispers from the students were louder than any announcement. "Did you see that? He finished first. That guy from MIT, he's still stuck on the last part." Jalen leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the results as they flashed on the screen. His name was there near the top, and as the applause from his competitors started to fade in the background, Jalen knew that the game had changed. He had shown up not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to himself that he could do this. The national competition was just the beginning, and as the next set of problems appeared, Jalen was ready to face whatever came next. The competition had barely started, but already Jalen could feel the intensity in the air. The first round had been a success, but now as he moved into the next phase, the stakes were even higher. The problems on the screen were more complicated, designed to push the brightest minds to the edge of their capabilities. The buzz in the auditorium grew as more students began to struggle. Some of them, once confident, were now showing signs of frustration. Others, who had breezed through the early questions, were now grinding to a halt, their pens hovering over the page as they stared blankly at the equations in front of them. Jalen, however, was calm. His mind was still sharp, still focused. He had already proven that he belonged here now. It was about finishing what he had started. Emma, who had been watching from the back of the room, saw the shift in the competition. The other students were beginning to lose confidence, but Jalen didn't waver. She knew that this wasn't just about solving the problems, it was about how Jalen handled the pressure, and he was handling it better than anyone else in the room. "He's not even breaking a sweat," she whispered to herself, a mix of admiration and awe in her voice. The competition had always been about more than math for Jalen. It had been about proving something to himself. And now, as the questions grew more difficult, Emma saw that he was rising to meet them, not just solving equations, but dismantling them, understanding their true structure in ways the others couldn't. At the front of the auditorium, the professors exchanged glances. They had been watching closely, but even they couldn't deny it. Jalen was excelling, and with each problem he solved, his name moved up the leaderboard. Professor Green, who had scoffed at Jalen in the past, was now leaning forward in his seat, his eyes narrowed, watching the young man with a mix of disbelief and begrudging respect. "I didn't think he had it in him," Green muttered to a colleague. "But look at him go. This isn't luck. This is something else." His colleague, the professor from Stanford, nodded slowly. "He's got a different way of thinking. We're all used to seeing math as a set of problems to be solved. He sees it as a puzzle to be solved, a language to be deciphered. Green didn't respond immediately. He was still processing what he was witnessing, still trying to reconcile the Jalen who had entered the competition as a dark horse with the Jalen who was now quickly moving up the ranks. He could hear the murmurs in the room, the growing admiration for the young man. This kid, he's better than I thought. As the second round ended, Jalen found himself in the final group of competitors. The top few spots had all been taken by students from prestigious schools, MIT, Caltech, Princeton, but Jalen's name was among them. The final round loomed, and he could feel the pressure mounting. His heart raced not out of fear, but out of the anticipation of what was to come. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about the recognition he had longed for, the acknowledgement that he had earned the right to be here. The last set of problems appeared on the screen more complex than anything that had come before. They weren't just equations. They were a test of everything Jalen had been through in the past month, his ability to think under pressure, his resilience, and his drive to succeed. This was the moment that could either make or break him. And yet, as he read through the problems, Jalen felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. His mind, sharp and clear, began working through the steps with the precision of a machine. The problems that seemed unsolvable to everyone else became in Jalen's hands just another puzzle to figure out. Professor Grant, standing at the front of the room with the other judges, watched him carefully. She had already seen the flashes of brilliance in Jalen, but now she could feel the weight of the competition settling on his shoulders. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just solving the problems, he was conquering them. And despite herself, she felt a flicker of respect. Jalen had earned her attention, but more than that, he had earned his place here. For the first time, she had no doubts. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the final seconds of the competition ticked away, Jalen set his pen down, his mind still racing through the final steps of the last problem. He had finished, and there was nothing more he could do. The room buzzed with the frantic energy of the remaining students, each one pushing to finish in time. But Jalen didn't rush. He had solved it with the quiet confidence that had defined him throughout the competition. The questions weren't obstacles to him. They were opportunities to showcase his skills, his intellect, his persistence. When the results were finally announced, Jalen's heart pounded in his chest. He had done his best, but that didn't always guarantee victory. Still, as the names of the finalists appeared on the screen, he saw his own at the very top. The crowd erupted into applause, a sound that felt distant to Jalen. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the accolades. What mattered to him was that in this moment, he had proven himself. To the professors, to the students, to everyone who had ever doubted him, but most importantly to himself. As Jalen stood outside the auditorium, the weight of the competition finally starting to lift, he heard the soft click of heels approaching. He turned almost instinctively to see Professor Grant walking toward him, her posture as rigid and authoritative as ever. But this time there was something different in her expression, a subtle shift in the way she regarded him. She stopped a few feet away from him, her eyes scanning him with a mix of curiosity and respect. For the first time since the competition began, Jalen saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before: acknowledgement, not just of his abilities, but of his place here in this room among the brightest minds. She didn't speak immediately, and for a moment, the tension between them felt almost palpable. Finally, Grant cleared her throat and spoke, her voice softer than usual, though still carrying the weight of authority. "You did well, Jalen." She said, her words measured as though carefully considering each one before it left her lips. "Better than I expected." Jalen stood still, not quite sure how to respond. This wasn't the professor he had come to know, the one who had challenged him relentlessly, who had dismissed him with her sharp criticisms. No, this was something else entirely. She was standing in front of him, not as a judge, but as someone who had been forced to reevaluate everything she had once believed. She paused, her gaze flicking to the students and professors still gathered inside the auditorium, most of whom were now looking at Jalen with new eyes. "You proved something today, not just to them, but to yourself." Her voice held a trace of something deeper, something almost like pride, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. Jalen didn't say anything right away. His mind was still processing the weight of her words. For so long, he had wanted to hear her acknowledge his abilities, to admit that he wasn't just a student who had somehow lucked into the competition. He had wanted to show her and everyone else that he belonged here. But now, with her words hanging in the air between them, he felt no need for further validation. He had already won not just the competition, but the internal battle he had been waging for so long. Professor Grant's eyes softened slightly, and she nodded a gesture of recognition that spoke louder than any words could. "I never thought you'd make it this far, Jalen, but you didn't just make it." She hesitated for a moment, almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of what she was about to say caught her off guard. "You've earned your place." There was a brief, pregnant pause before she turned, her expression returning to its usual composed professional demeanor. "Good work." And with that, she walked away, the echo of her footsteps on the tiled floor, punctuating the finality of the moment. Jalen watched her for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment wash over him. He hadn't needed her recognition, but hearing it from someone like her, someone who had always seen him as less than worthy, felt like the final seal on his victory. As the door to the auditorium clicked shut behind her, Jalen allowed himself to breathe deeply, the realization settling in he had done it. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever doubted him. The professors, the students, even those who had once dismissed him, now looked at him with a new sense of respect. They had witnessed his rise, his persistence, and his unwavering determination. Jalen hadn't just entered the competition to prove he was smart. He had entered to prove that talent was not defined by your background, your name, or your pedigree. It was defined by what you could accomplish when you believed in yourself. Jalen didn't need their recognition. He didn't need anyone's approval. He had earned it all on his own. And that was enough. Jalen's journey through the national math competition was a true testament to resilience, determination, and self-belief. He not only faced the intense pressure of competing against the best minds in the country, but also shattered the expectations placed upon him. It's a story that reminds us that no matter where we come from, no matter the challenges or the doubts people place on us, the greatest strength comes from within. Jalen showed us that the true power lies in trusting ourselves, staying focused on our goals, and proving our worth through hard work and perseverance. His victory wasn't just about solving math problems. It was about overcoming every barrier, every prejudice, and every obstacle placed in his path. It was about proving that he was more than capable of achieving greatness on his own terms. And now we want to hear from you. If you were in Jalen's shoes, how would you handle the pressure and expectations? How would you push through to prove your worth? If Jalen's story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button to join us as we continue to bring you more stories of courage, determination, and growth. Let's spread the power of self-belief and inspire others to believe in themselves too. Thank you for being part of our community and for listening. We can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.